In the summer of 2001, Arthur Labe sat inside a traditional German beer garden with his family. The middle-aged man lived on Vancouver Island in Canada, where he worked as a house painter. But now he was on his dream vacation in Germany, visiting relatives that he hadn't seen for years. He'd been looking forward to this trip for ages, and he was having a total blast. Arthur felt grateful to be on this vacation at all. A few months earlier, he had coughed up some blood, and his wife Carol insisted that he go see their doctor on Vancouver Island. The doctor would tell Arthur that he was worried about lung cancer since Arthur had been a smoker when he was young. Thankfully, Arthur's chest x-rays and follow-up testing indicated he didn't have cancer, and his doctor said that it was fine for Arthur to go to Germany and enjoy his trip. And his cough actually cleared up completely a few days before he left for the trip. Arthur took a big swig of his beer and then thought about how great it felt to sit down and relax after a full day of walking all over the city. The walking was actually the only part of the trip that Arthur was not enjoying. They'd been on their feet so much that his lower back was starting to hurt. And so Arthur made a mental note to stop by a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel for some pain relievers or maybe a hot pad. Arthur took another big sip of his beer and then looked around at all the other tourists crowded into the beer garden. Then he nodded his head at the polka band in appreciation and then settled in, enjoying a sunny afternoon and the warm glow of a nice German beer. 2 hours later, the sun had sunk behind the trees, and Arthur stood up from the table to head back to the hotel. As he got to his feet, a shock of pain burst through his lower back. Arthur immediately sank back into his seat, very surprised. Then he tried to stand again, but every time he moved, a burning pain shot through his back and up his spine. Carol was surprised that her husband couldn't stand and asked what was wrong. Arthur told her he just needed to breathe for a second, but after a few minutes, the pain was still shooting up his back. And every time he tried to stand up, the pressure on his back was blinding. Finally, he just shook his head and told Carol he did need to go to the hospital. Something was going on with his back. She nodded, then asked their son-in-law, Brian, to run and grab their rental car. 15 minutes later, Arthur sat in the front passenger seat as Brian drove towards the hospital with Carol and Arthur's daughter, Jenny, in the back seat. Every time the car hit a bump, Arthur gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur could feel a brutal headache coming on too, and he wondered if the way he was feeling now had anything to do with that nasty cough he had back home. Finally, the car turned a corner, and Arthur saw the hospital up ahead, and not a moment too soon, because right at that moment, Arthur's vision had begun to blur, so he was leaning his head against the headrest and closing his eyes. He felt hot and achy, and his forehead was dripping with sweat, and by the time the car actually stopped, Arthur felt delirious. In fact, Arthur barely noticed as his car door opened and 2 hospital staff reached in to help him stand up. An hour later, Arthur opened his eyes and realized he was lying on his side in a hospital bed with an IV drip in his arm. Slowly, the beige room came into focus. He could hear the whirring and beeping of machines in the room, as well as conversations drifting in from the hallway. The room suddenly felt chilly, and Arthur hoped that his fever might be breaking. His headache was getting less intense too, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt like he could actually think clearly. Arthur looked down towards the foot of his bed, and he saw Carol speaking to a middle-aged doctor in a very quiet voice. When Carol noticed Arthur was awake, she smiled at him, but Arthur knew his wife well, and he knew the look she was giving him was her putting on a very brave face. Something clearly was wrong. At this point, the doctor turned to Arthur and introduced himself as Dr. Gent. He told Arthur that while he was unconscious, they'd performed a spinal tap so they could examine his spinal fluid for potential infections, and the lab work had just come back. Dr. Gent kept a neutral expression as he told Arthur that his spinal fluid had a high white blood cell count, which indicated that his body was fighting an infection. Dr. Gent suspected that Arthur had a very serious condition called bacterial meningitis, which meant that the membranes that protected his brain and spinal column were swelling. He explained that meningitis is a potentially life-threatening infection, but they had already started Arthur on antibiotics, so he should make a full recovery. Arthur felt overwhelmed by everything the doctor was saying, and he just wanted to know how long it was going to be before he felt better again. But before he could ask any questions, Dr. Gent told him to try and rest. He was going to be in the hospital for a few days at least. A week later, Arthur's daughter, Jenny, was getting ready to go to work on Vancouver Island. Jenny had decided to fly back to Canada while her father was still in the hospital, but she couldn't stop worrying about him. So far, doctors in Germany had tried 6 different antibiotics, but her dad didn't respond to any of them. He just kept getting sicker. Jenny was about to head out the door when her phone rang. She lunged for it, knowing it was the time her mother usually called from Germany. For a split second, Jenny hoped that her mom was calling to say her dad was all better, and they were just going to resume their vacation and everything was great. But as soon as Jenny picked up the phone, she could hear that her mom was crying. Carol told Jenny that the swelling in her father's brain was getting worse, and now Dr. Gent was saying that it looked like her father was going to die. Jenny had not prepared herself for the possibility of losing her dad, and she scrambled to think of some way she could help. Finally, she offered to drive over to her dad's doctor's office here on Vancouver Island to basically fill in Arthur's primary care doctor about what was going on, to see if maybe he had some ideas that the doctors in Germany had not tried yet. An hour later, Jenny fidgeted as she watched her father's doctor in Vancouver Island review her dad's scans on a computer monitor and flip through his lab results. He asked Jenny a few questions about her dad's condition, and she did her best to fill in the blanks. Finally, the doctor closed the files and turned to her, and she sat up expectantly. But he just shook his head and told Jenny that, despite her father's serious illness, his charts looked remarkably normal. The doctor told her that her dad was in good health when he left for Germany. He might have picked up a bug while on the trip, but his infection should be responding to antibiotics by now. Jenny begged the doctor to please just look one more time, and then Jenny held her breath as the doctor did pick up the lab results and looked them over one more time. Then Jenny noticed the doctor's expression change, like something had just occurred to him. Then he leaned in and he told Jenny there was one possible but highly unlikely explanation. Jenny asked him to please tell her. At this point, her family was willing to consider anything. So the doctor explained that several weeks ago, her father's blood work had shown no signs of lung cancer, and they had rejoiced. But lost in the excitement was some less positive news. Arthur's blood had tested positive for a fungal infection called Cryptococcus. A lot of people get Cryptococcus, which had existed on Vancouver Island for years, but it's usually harmless, and most people's immune systems fight it off easily. It's only dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. And Arthur's immune system at the time was fine, so the doctor didn't even tell Arthur that he had this fungal infection. Jenny asked if this fungus could cause meningitis, and the doctor nodded, but only in extremely rare cases. However, if her father's meningitis was caused by a fungal infection, he would need completely different medications than what he was receiving in Germany right now. Antibiotics cannot stop a fungal infection. If Jenny's father had fungal meningitis, that would mean that for the past few days, the treatments Arthur was receiving in Germany were doing nothing. Jenny tried to stay calm as the doctor placed a call to the hospital in Germany. If they started Arthur on antifungal medication right now, he might survive. Jenny just hoped they weren't too late. Several months later, in the early winter of 2002, an animal pathologist named Sally Lester was in her laboratory on mainland British Columbia, a few miles away from Arthur's home. She slid a glass slide under her microscope, then bent down over the eyepiece to take a look. The slide she had put under there contained tissue from the carcass of a dead porpoise that had washed up on the beach on nearby Vancouver Island. Dr. Lester focused her lens on a tiny cell that looked like a boiled egg. This kind of cell had become a familiar sight to her over the past year. These odd egg-shaped cells had been sent to Dr. Lester from veterinary clinics all around Vancouver Island. A growing number of sick dogs and cats were showing up at vet clinics with shortness of breath and discharge running from their noses. In more serious cases, the animals were having seizures. Some had mysterious lumps on their heads, and all of the animals had pockets of pus called abscesses below their eyes. Veterinarians had sent in samples of the abscess tissue to Dr. Lester so she could examine them in her lab, and every time she'd found these little yellow cells that looked like boiled eggs. She knew what the cells meant, that the animals were infected with Cryptococcus, a fungus that grew on Vancouver Island. It was common for animals and humans alike to contract Cryptococcus by inhaling the spores floating in the air. Humans and animals rarely got sick from these spores. In fact, Dr. Lester usually saw no more than maybe 6 to 10 animals with Cryptococcus infections in a year. But recently, vets on Vancouver Island had been sending her about 10 cases every single month. Dr. Lester was stumped about what could be causing the number of these infections to rise so quickly. Then, porpoises began washing up on shore, which had given Dr. Lester a very eerie feeling. Dead porpoises should rarely wash ashore, but now it was happening every few weeks. And when she began reading the porpoise autopsy reports, she started feeling even more unnerved. The porpoise's lungs had been riddled with inflammation from pneumonia. Their organs were swollen and covered in flower-like tumors. And now, as Dr. Lester looked at the slide, she realized that all this damage was being caused by a Cryptococcus infection. The porpoise's blood was loaded with the fungus. Dr. Lester sat back on her stool, feeling a knot starting to form in her gut. She knew how porpoises would have contracted the Cryptococcus spores. Since spores are airborne, the fungus would have floated out over the ocean and settled on top of the water. The porpoises would have inhaled the spores when they came up and broke the surface to breathe. What she didn't understand was why the number of cases was increasing now. Something weird was definitely going on. And then Dr. Lester had a chilling thought. If more animals are getting fungal infections, maybe more people are too. After all, we all breathe the same air. Dr. Lester picked up the phone to call the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. She knew it was now time to get the human infectious disease authorities involved. Half an hour later, Dr. Murray Fife hung up the phone on his desk at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. He was the organization's head epidemiologist, and he had been absolutely swamped lately. And now, after speaking with Dr. Lester, he needed a moment to consider what she had told him about this potential outbreak of fungal infections on Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wanted to get feedback on Dr. Lester's concerns from a colleague who lived on Vancouver Island. So he picked up the phone again, this time to call the Vancouver Island Health Authority. The microbiologist who picked up said very matter-of-factly that Dr. Lester was right. There was a definite increase in human Cryptococcus infections on Vancouver Island, but not among the patients they would normally expect. Usually, it was just people with compromised immune systems that got sick from Cryptococcus, but lately, healthy adults were getting sick from the fungus. It was bizarre and basically unheard of. It made no sense to Dr. Fife. Cryptococcus fungus had been on Vancouver Island for years, so why was it suddenly so dangerous now? He worried that something about the fungus itself was changing, and he wondered if it could even be stopped. A few days later, Dr. Fife sat in a conference room totally surrounded by piles of hospital records and feeling completely exhausted. For the last week, he and a scientist at the University of British Columbia named Karen Bartlett had been combing the region's hospital records in hopes of finding other Cryptococcus infections. His eyes hurt from hours spent reading, but they still had not figured out when the number of infections had begun to rise. Dr. Bartlett cleared her throat and looked up while holding a file above her head. Dr. Fife raised his eyebrows as she explained that this file, was the oldest human case she'd found. It was from over 2 years ago, the beginning of 1999. The patient had been in good health when Cryptococcus made her sick, just like a lot of the recent cases. A few minutes later, Dr. Bartlett gasped and handed Dr. Fife another file. It was the medical records of a lively 45-year-old mother who had started to feel lousy just a few months ago in the fall of 2001. By the time the doctors tested her for Cryptococcus, the fungus had infected her brain and she died shortly after. Dr. Fife was shocked. He'd never heard of Cryptococcus killing an otherwise healthy adult. Even Arthur Laib, who'd been on death's door in Germany last summer, he'd recovered from his infection after receiving antifungal treatment. Suddenly, the stakes in their investigation seemed much higher. Not only were healthy adults contracting Cryptococcus, but the fungus was now, apparently, deadly, and Dr. Fife had no idea why. A week later, Dr. Fife was back at his desk, feeling both amazed and horrified at the unfolding health crisis. After he and Dr. Bartlett discovered that Cryptococcus infections were killing people on Vancouver Island, they'd sent samples of the fungus to a lab for further analysis. And now Dr. Fife was staring at the test results, and they weren't at all what he expected. The fungus that was infecting the animals and the people on Vancouver Island was an entirely new kind of Cryptococcus fungus than what had been on Vancouver Island for years. Under the microscope, analysts could tell that the new Cryptococcus was a completely different species from what residents were used to. But the new strain should never have been in Vancouver Island. The newcomer strain of Cryptococcus is typically found in the bark of eucalyptus trees in Australia and other warm places. It had never been seen so far north, and especially not in a cold and damp climate like Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wondered how a tropical fungus got so far north. There were hardly any eucalyptus trees on Vancouver Island, which meant that Dr. Fife had no idea where the fungus was hiding, or how it could even survive in this environment. Dr. Fife called Dr. Bartlett to explain the alarming lab results and admit he had no idea how to find this toxic new fungus. She paused, then told him she had an idea. She said it was time to get some boots on the ground. A week later, Dr. Bartlett stood on a residential street on Vancouver Island, surrounded by several students from a local college. These were her volunteers, and together they were going to comb the backyards and backwoods of all of Vancouver Island, searching for answers. Dr. Bartlett looked from student to student and reminded them of their objective. They would dig up soil samples and swab tree barks in the hopes that they would capture the new strain of Cryptococcus in the wild. Each student nodded and said they understood. So Dr. Bartlett divided them into teams. She sent 2 teams to collect samples around the neighborhood. Then she led her group to the first house on the street where the owner was expecting them. Dr. Bartlett was pleased to see that the homeowner, who was a middle-aged woman with tanned and sun-worn skin, was waiting in the garage. Dr. Bartlett waved as she and her volunteers walked up the driveway, and the woman led them around into her backyard. Dr. Bartlett had selected this house for a very specific reason. The homeowner, the woman, had survived a recent Cryptococcus infection. Dr. Bartlett hoped that the fungus might be found somewhere in this woman's immediate environment, but failing that, Dr. Bartlett thought that by interviewing this woman and other survivors, once she knew what they all had in common, she could use that information to track down the source of the fungus. Dr. Bartlett nodded to the students, and they fanned out into the backyard. She watched as they stooped over flower beds and scraped bark off trees, and while the students went to work, Dr. Bartlett interviewed the woman who lived there. Dr. Bartlett asked the woman where she went on a daily basis, and the woman listed off popular nature trails she liked to hike, beaches she frequented, and also the friends and family that she visited most often. Eventually, Dr. Bartlett had asked all her questions, so she thanked the woman for helping and then tucked her notes into her satchel. Then, once all her students were done taking their samples, Dr. Bartlett led them down the street to the next house on their list. A few days later, Dr. Bartlett sat in a conference room at the British Columbia CDC, going over her notes while she waited for Dr. Fife. Dr. Bartlett was feeling frustrated. After canvassing what seemed like the entirety of Vancouver Island, none of the samples that she or her volunteers had collected had come back positive for spores of this new type of Cryptococcus. And her interviews with all these survivors had led nowhere too. The only thing the infected people on her list had in common was that they all lived on Vancouver Island, which of course made it impossible to pinpoint where the spores were actually coming from. They could be anywhere on the island. A few moments later, Dr. Fife walked into the office with a grim look on his face. He told Dr. Bartlett that somebody else had just shown up at a Vancouver Island hospital with a Cryptococcus infection, which brought the total of people infected to 30 so far. Dr. Bartlett had this nagging sense that the situation, which was already bad, could actually still get much worse. The summer of 2002 was approaching, and she was worried that there could be an explosion of cases as the weather got warmer. She stood and began pacing the room, racking her brain for ideas. Dr. Fife leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. But then Dr. Bartlett stopped pacing. She turned to Dr. Fife and asked if he'd be up for a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights. He laughed a little because he always did late nights and they always worked all the time, but Dr. Bartlett could tell, he was up for more. So Dr. Bartlett explained what she had in mind. Since her interviews with infected people had failed to get the information they needed, She suggested they start talking to the owners of infected pets. There were so many animal cases that there might be an overlap in the animals' daily schedules. It was a long shot, but there was a chance that it would help them pinpoint where the fungus spores were coming from. Dr. Fife nodded and asked Dr. Bartlett if she'd like some coffee. If they were going to spend the next few weeks driving all over Vancouver Island interviewing hundreds and hundreds of pet owners, they would need a lot more caffeine. A week later, Dr. Bartlett climbed out of her car and knocked on the door of a house on Vancouver Island. A broad-shouldered woman with big brown eyes answered the door, and Dr. Bartlett followed her into the kitchen. This was the 24th pet owner that Dr. Bartlett had interviewed in person, so at this point, she basically had her questions memorized. She began by asking where the pet owner regularly took her dog. And the woman gave predictable answers, like hiking trails and restaurants and friends' houses. Except this time, the broad-shouldered woman also mentioned a place called Rathtrevor Beach Provincial Park. That name stuck with Dr. Bartlett through the rest of the interview because other pet owners had mentioned it as well, and so Dr. Bartlett felt like that place might be worth looking into. About 36 hours later, Dr. Bartlett met her student volunteers at Rathtrevor Beach and told them to swab everything. And 2 weeks after submitting those samples, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Fife had a startling realization. Fir trees all over Rathtrevor Beach tested positive for the new deadly fungus, and so the air in this park contained huge quantities of spores. And once Dr. Fife and Dr. Bartlett looked into this park further, the explanation for why this was became clear. Because of its location, the weather at Rathtrevor Beach was unlike the rest of Vancouver Island. It was warmer and enjoyed a drier, more Mediterranean climate. In other words, it was the perfect place for a fungus that prefers the warm, dry air of Australia rather than the typically chilly and wet Canada. So anybody who stopped at that park or just lived near it would have been breathing in these spores day in and day out. And most of the people who had contracted this infection were eventually found to have gone into or near this park. In the summer of 2002, Dr. Fife posted signs at Rathtrevor Beach Park warning people about the danger posed by this fungus. However, the park was not closed because Dr. Bartlett and her students eventually found spores in several other spots on Vancouver Island as well. So they realized there was really no way to actually contain the outbreak because clearly it basically had spread all around the island. Between 1999 and 2006, 165 human cases of Cryptococcus infections were reported in British Columbia. In total, 8 people died. As for Arthur Laib, he recovered from the disease once his hospital in Germany put him on that antifungal medication, and he was ultimately able to return to work, but his wife Carol says he's not quite as active as he used to be. Nobody knows how this fungus arrived on Vancouver Island, but the spores can live on surfaces for many, many years. So it could have been transported by humans or wind currents coming up from the tropics, or even by porpoises that migrated across the ocean. Today, scientists are still working to find a way to prevent this infection, but currently, most scientists think there's really nothing we can do until humans and animals just naturally develop immunity to the disease. Sevnica is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia, situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest rivers in Europe. The section of the Sava that flows past Sevnica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists up until 2008, when a hydroelectric dam was built across it, creating a sort of dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. They would have to stop at the dam, get out, walk around, and then pick up the river on the other side, or that would mark the end of their trip that day. In 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Sevnica, who was in favor of the construction of this dam, he understood that this was kind of a bummer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide more electricity for the town, it did kind of end an era. And so he decided he would organize a final trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. And he was calling this trip the Final Descent. And so he went all around town asking people if they wanted to come, and he finally recruited 27 other people to come with him on this final trip. And so a few weeks later, on July 3rd, after all preparations were made, the mayor and the rest of his crew, they made their way upstream to this loading area where 4 canoes have been set out for them. And the staff people that had actually provided these canoes, they offered the group life jackets. And virtually everyone in the group turned it down. It's unclear why they turned down the life jackets, but one could guess that, the river itself was incredibly calm and they were not expecting to be on the water for very long. And so they just decided they didn't need one. And so after all 28 people got into their canoes, 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and they began their slow trip down the river. And the mayor had actually hired a photographer to come along with them to document their journey. So as soon as they take off, the photographer is looking around, taking pictures and filming. The weather was beautiful and the water was calm and everything was just going really, really well. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, they turned this corner and they got a clear view of the dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not done yet, but it was pretty close to being done. And so the actual structure of the dam, it was built. And so even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious to tell that up ahead, there's these big cement archways where the water flows down over this dam. And the whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to the mayor, had been they would get to this dam, but on the left side of the dam, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because when this dam was complete, it would completely obstruct the river side to side. But because it wasn't actually done yet, the construction crew had told the mayor that, yep, the left side, there's going to be an area where you can basically just casually go right past. You won't go down the dam. It's totally safe. But here this group is on the water looking at the dam. And even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the dam. You clearly had to go through the dam or you had to get out and go around the dam. Now, the river was moving very, very slowly. There wasn't a strong current. And so there wasn't some urgent decision that needed to be made about what they were going to do. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here is to, go to the side, get out of your canoes, and either go around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the other canoes got the idea that, hey, why don't we just go over the dam? I know we're not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said, don't go over the dam. It's extremely dangerous. But from the looks of it, it doesn't look that bad. And truthfully, it did not look too bad. This was not some enormous dam with some huge drop-off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water kind of went down this fairly small embankment. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet long, and at the bottom of this embankment was some semi-rough water. But overall, it just looked like it might be kind of fun to go down this dam, like you'd be going down a slide with your canoe. And so the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be fun, it was going to be an adventure. So before long, 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe that was not prepared to go over the dam had the photographer in it. And they said, we're not comfortable with this, but we'll pull up next to the dam and we'll just film you guys going over the dam. It'll be really cool. And so after making their plans about who was going to do what, the 4 canoes continued down the river. And when they got about maybe 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to this dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off on the left side of the river. They got out and the photographer lifted up his camera and he began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their approach into the dam. Now, the video from this photographer that was released to the public, it shows the first of these 3 canoes actually going into the dam. And you see these 7 people on this canoe. They're kind of happy and excited looking. They have nervous anticipation like they're about to start a roller coaster or something. And they're making their way into this dark section inside of the dam. They're basically going through the gates of the dam where they're going to go down this embankment. And as they go into the darkness, as you begin to lose sight of them, you see the back end of the canoe suddenly pops up because now they're going down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream. And then it goes completely silent. And then the video just ends. That canoe, right after it slid down that downslope, it would reach the waters below, but the canoe would capsize, throwing everyone on board into the water. And these 7 people, they didn't even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. Not only because the water was rough at the bottom of the dam and kind of was churning and pulling them under, but also because this is a hydroelectric dam. And at the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they were all these big openings to underwater tunnels. And these tunnels functioned like vacuums. It pulled water down inside and then ran the water past a turbine, causing it to spin, and that would generate the electricity. That's what the dam actually did. And so after the water was pushed past this turbine, it would be jettisoned out somewhere else downstream. Now, even though this dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them, they were operational. So as these 7 people are dumped into these incredibly dangerous waters and they're getting pulled down towards these tunnels, the other 2 canoes, they have no idea what's going on with this first canoe, and so they just continue on and they go over the dam. The second canoe that went down the dam, they also capsized at the bottom. All 7 occupants were thrown out and they were sucked down underwater almost immediately. The third canoe that went over the dam, they did not capsize. And so after they cleared the dam and kind of paddled away, they began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there. And there was nobody out in front of them. And so they turned around thinking maybe they're closer to the dam and they don't see anyone, but they see one of the canoes is completely flipped over and the other canoe has been broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam. And they see the wood from this canoe just getting tumbled around. And so this third canoe immediately turns and tries to paddle over to the base of this dam to try to start pulling people out of the water. But when they get over there, there's no one there. The 14 people that had been in these 2 canoes, they're gone. Ultimately, 13 of the 14 people that fell in the water that day would perish, and one of the fatalities was the mayor. The only person who survived who fell in the water was actually the mayor's wife, who by some miracle managed to swim out of the grasp of these tunnels under the water and made it to shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers were able to eventually find all 13 bodies, one of which had traveled 25 miles away to Croatia. No information was given about the state of the bodies when they were found, and so we don't know if having been sucked down through these tunnels and forced past these underwater turbines played a role in their death. All the public knows is that all or most of these 13 people were sucked down into these tunnels and then they died. Our next story is called Dead Hang. Despite the fact that today there is already tons of shocking content on the internet, there is still something truly insane about Wu Yongning's videos. In 2017, Wu was a 26-year-old climbing enthusiast who was dubbed China's first rooftopper. A rooftopper is someone who, usually illegally, climbs onto rooftops, cranes, smokestacks, big antennas, skyscrapers, or any other really high, dangerous location. Almost always, these daredevils are going to these incredibly dangerous locations in order to capture footage of themselves so they can post it to the internet in hopes that it goes viral and they become famous and make a bunch of money. But because there are so many people competing for the internet's attention, rooftoppers really need to push the envelope if they want to stand out and make it big. And Wu Yongning did just that, and the internet rewarded him with millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most rooftoppers would go to the tops of these incredible locations and then take selfies of themselves standing there posing at the top. Wu would do that, but he also did a couple other things that nobody else was doing that kind of became his trademarks. The first one was he would dangle over the edge of the building or the crane or the antenna that he was holding onto, and he would do pull-ups, but he would keep doing them until he reached muscle failure and then would barely be able to pull himself back up to safety. Another trademark move is he would go to the top of these huge buildings and he would get right on the edge and he would do a handstand and then he would pull one arm back. So he's doing a one-armed handstand and then he would tilt his body as far as he could over the edge until he couldn't do it any farther and he'd let himself come back over to safety. And then perhaps the most difficult to watch trademark was when Wu would basically run up to the edge of buildings and stop just short. And he wouldn't just run to the edge, he would use a self-balancing scooter and go as fast as he could right to the edge of the building and stop just short. And over again, he'd go right to the edge and stop, where he's literally an inch away from tumbling off the edge. Or he'd line himself up where he knew exactly how far he was from the edge, and he would do these really aggressive somersaults forward, and he would stop with his legs dangling off the edge of the building. And of course, all of these trademark moves were done without any safety equipment, and most times Wu did these stunts without anybody there to potentially pull him back up if he gets stuck. About 3/4 of the way through 2017, Wu had posted over 500 videos and live streaming clips to various social media sites, and he was starting to make some real money off of it. On one video sharing site alone, he had made over $80,000 just from donations that had come in. And so it was clear this was becoming a career. But as the money and the fame were coming into Wu, he started to realize that in order for him to stay on top and keep earning at this level, he would need to continuously outperform his last big stunt. And already he was brushing up against death on virtually every video he took. In early November of that year, Wu heard about a competition that was offering $15,000 to its winner. The details of this competition are hazy at best, but from the sounds of it, it was a viral video competition. Make the most viral video and you win the prize. This competition served as motivation for Wu to finally attempt his craziest stunt yet. He figured if he had the footage of this particular stunt, he was sure to win this competition, and with the prize money, he could pay for his wedding and cover his mother's medical expenses. And so on November 8th, Wu traveled to the Huaiyan International Center in central China. This massive 62-story skyscraper would be the tallest building Wu had ever performed a stunt on. The public was only able to get up to the 44th floor, and so Wu had to take the elevator up to somewhere between the 40th and 44th floor, at which point he climbed out of a window and free climbed his way all the way up to the top, so 20 additional floors just climbing the side of a skyscraper. Once he got to the rooftop, he set up his tripod and his camera, and he turned on his live stream. And then he walked around and he began preparing himself for the stunt. Livestream viewers that tuned in would see Wu sitting on the edge of the skyscraper, and he's meticulously wiping down the edge of this building. It's the area he'll be grabbing onto to perform his stunt, which was going to be his trademark pull-ups. And so after several minutes of Wu cleaning this ledge, he begins to lower himself where his arms are still tucked up over the ledge. So he's not hanging, he's got his arms kind of anchored on the top. He's like testing the edge of this lip. And he kind of feels around and he can tell that it's not a good grip. It's not good enough for him to go down to a full extension. And so he pulls himself back up and he goes back to wiping down the edge. And from the looks of it, it seems like Wu is actually pretty nervous about this stunt. And normally when you watch Wu's videos, he doesn't seem nervous at all, even leading up to his stunt. But this one just seemed different. And so after again wiping down this ledge as much as he possibly could, he gets himself ready, lowers himself onto his arms, he lets his legs drop over the edge of the building, and then he goes to full extension. And from there, he does 2 complete pull-ups, and then after the second pull-up, he begins to try to pull himself back up to safety. But he's fatigued, and he can't quite get himself up over the edge. He starts to use his feet to try to use the glass to push himself back up, but he can't get a grip. And for the next 15 seconds, Wu is desperately trying to get himself up and over this ledge. He's trying to muscle himself up, but it's obvious he's completely fatigued. I mean, he did free climb almost 20 stories to get up there, and so it makes sense his arms would be tired. But there's nobody up there to help pull him up. And so after a while, he goes back to full extension because he can't do anything, and he looks down as if he's sizing up if he can survive this fall, which he obviously can't. And then the camera picks up a sort of whimpering sound that appears to come from Wu, and then he loses his grip and he falls to his death.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Death Valley. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States
packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert, roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died, and he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Darmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley. And actually, there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs. And so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually, Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden, his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat. And so to the naked eye, it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard-packed, and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle. And underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical. He was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California. And the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company, and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires, and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was, and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van, and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day he would contact the towing company again, and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back, and that would be it. So Robert got out, he said thank you to the couple, and he waved to them as they drove off, and then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous. So even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water.
On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived and Wang greeted them and brought them inside. And then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed. And also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to MC that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything. And so Wang sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive. And he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wang walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it. And then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wang did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wang was laying right underneath this hole in the roof and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wang had unfortunately been struck by lightning. 2 days later, Wang's family held a funeral for Wang, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wang was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wang had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wang. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wang was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wang would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects. And then at that point, the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wang's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen. And then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wang's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then, of course, ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wong's casket, which was already placed on the rails. Workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wong's body, and he confirms that Wong is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder. And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up, and there's smoke filling the room, and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace. And he hits the emergency stop, and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky and it's totally chaotic, and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on. And the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wong, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wong was struck by lightning. So remember, Wong's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole. They need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball-sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wong? Well, unfortunately for Wong, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds, where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wang was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wang's head, blowing off a portion of his head, and then the rocket itself got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wang's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wang's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault, we did this. And so they compensated Wang's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wang's death, the Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate. On January 30th, 1989, two young men were working the afternoon lunch shift at a Domino's pizza restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. Their names were Daryl Wilson and Sean Burnset. And most weeks, this shift that they worked together was really boring because virtually nobody came into the restaurant. But on this day, at around 11 a.m., as Daryl and Sean are kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the shift to end, a man who was obviously disgruntled and very agitated stormed in the door carrying a gun, a .357 Magnum gun, so a really powerful handgun, and he aimed it straight at them. Daryl and Sean were so shocked by this that at first they didn't do anything. But then it kind of dawned on them that, oh my goodness, this guy's coming in here to rob the place. And so Daryl and Sean suddenly put their hands up and they begin saying, okay, take whatever you want, take whatever you want. And the man suddenly began shouting something at them like he wanted something. And it took Daryl and Sean a second to kind of understand what he was asking for. But when they started to process the things he was saying, they kind of understood that this did not seem like a robbery. The guy was demanding that they call Tom S. Monahan so he, this guy, the guy with the gun, can talk to Tom. Now, Daryl and Sean may have known this, but probably not, because they likely didn't care. But Tom S. Monahan, at the time, was the owner of Domino's. Not like this particular restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia, but like the entire national chain. He was the actual owner of the company. And so this guy is coming in being like, let me talk to the owner of Domino's. And so at some point, Daryl and Sean understood who Tom S. Monahan was. Perhaps the guy with the gun explained it, or maybe one of them did know who Tom S. Monahan was. But either way, Daryl and Sean suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this guy wants to talk to the owner. But they have no way of getting in touch with the owner of Domino's. They're just pizza cooks. They're not like connected to the C-suite. But when Daryl and Sean told the guy like, hey, we don't know how to get in touch with the literal owner of this major franchise, well, the guy didn't like that. And he got really frantic and began yelling and screaming like, you gotta do it, you gotta get Tom on the phone. And so Daryl and Sean are like, okay, and they grab the phone and they try to call their own boss because they don't know who else to call. And as they're calling their own boss, this guy fires 2 shots into the ceiling. So this is like a really high intensity situation that's escalating really quickly. But Daryl, who actually was the one on the phone, he did his best to stay calm, and when his boss got on the other line, he tried his best to explain the situation as quickly as he could, because he could tell, this guy with the gun is very close to potentially shooting them. And the boss of Daryl and Sean did understand, okay, clearly there is a crisis happening at this branch. And when Daryl said, you gotta find a way to get Tom S. Monahan on the phone, like right now, well, his boss was like, I got it. And a few minutes later, Daryl's boss, who's still on the phone with him, was like, okay, I'm gonna patch you through. And then a second later, Tom S. Monahan hops on the phone and he's like, what's going on? And at this point, Daryl just handed the phone over to the guy with the gun and said, here you go, Tom's on the phone. And the man with the gun grabbed the phone, put it to his ear, and then began rattling off these totally bizarre demands. He wanted a white limousine to show up to the restaurant to be his getaway car. He wanted $10,000 in cash, and he wanted a copy of a science fiction novel about the Freemasons called The Widow's Son. And so Daryl and Sean, who are behind the counter witnessing this, they're hearing these demands, and it's clicking for them that clearly this guy is not mentally well. This is a guy who's totally unhinged, and who knows what's going to happen. After a few minutes on the phone, the gunman hung up and then told Daryl and Sean very calmly that now the three of them were just going to sit in this restaurant and wait for his demands to be met. And for the next 5.5 hours, that's what they did. Daryl, Sean, and the gunman, who just kept the gun aimed at Daryl and Sean, they just sat inside of this restaurant. And at the same time, by this point, the police have been called, and they're completely surrounding this restaurant. And when the gunman came into the store, because this was a very slow day, there weren't any other customers or staff inside, so it really was just Daryl, Sean, and the gunman. And so it's a total standoff. But interestingly, for Sean and Daryl, who were right there with this gunman, they started to sense that this guy was not here to hurt them. He was really after Tom S. Monahan, and over those 5.5 hours, they were just sitting there with him with his gun aimed right at them. He periodically began telling them, what his gripes were with Tom S. Monahan. The gunman told Daryl and Sean that Tom was specifically targeting him, the gunman, and also Tom was secretly communicating with the gunman when the gunman didn't want to talk to him, almost like telekinesis or something. And also the gunman told them that Tom S. Monahan periodically will walk around his property at night, kind of creeping around, scaring the gunman. And Daryl and Sean, they're hearing these things and not believing any of it, but they were very empathetic and said, oh yeah, I can understand why that would be an issue. I can understand why you'd come in here and demand to speak to Tom S. Monahan. Yep, totally get it. And that was just kind of how the day was going. And then around 4:30 p.m., so they've been in there a long time by this point, the gunman told Daryl and Sean that he was really hungry, so they better go make him some pizzas. So Daryl and Sean just got up, they went in the back, they made 2 large everything pizzas, and after they were made, they put them in boxes and slid them across the counter to the gunman. And at this moment, Daryl and Sean knew the gunman, in order to eat, would have to put his weapon down to open up the box and get the pizza. And so the second they handed it over, without even communicating with each other, they kind of waited for the gunman to put the gun down. And he did. He put the gun down, he opened the pizza up, he grabbed a slice, and at that moment, Daryl and Sean began sprinting past him towards the door, and the gunman, who's seeing this happen, he drops the pizza, he grabs the gun, and he turns, and he aims. So to really understand what's happening here, you need to understand what type of marketing Domino's, like the national franchise, was doing to advertise their product. Starting in 1985, Domino's came up with a very popular advertising campaign called The Noid. And the Noid was actually a character. It was like this weird claymation character with big sneakers and bunny ears. He was like this goofy thing that was the equivalent of McDonald's Hamburglar, but this was for pizza. And what Domino's did with the Noid is they would run these ads on TV where the Noid was like this menace who was always out to disrupt pizza deliveries. Not necessarily Domino's pizza deliveries, but generally pizza deliveries, it's like the Noid's gonna destroy them, either by, freezing the pizzas on their way to the person's house, or smashing them into the ground, or causing whatever mayhem the Noid could create to stop pizzas from getting to their customers. And so Domino's kind of catchy thing was avoid the Noid with Domino's, meaning like Domino's, the chain, was the only chain capable of avoiding all the chaos that could disrupt you getting the thing you want, your pizza. And this advertising campaign was brilliant, not only because it really worked, people really liked Domino's because it did seem like they were superior, but also they were able to kind of franchise this character itself, the Noid. It became a toy you could buy, and there was talk about doing a TV show and maybe a movie around this Noid character. And Michael Jackson, like the king of pop, he put the Noid in one of his music videos. I mean, this was a really, really successful advertising campaign, but for as successful as this campaign was, it did unfortunately lead to what happened inside of this Domino's restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. So on the day this gunman came charging in and held up the place, aiming the gun at Sean and Daryl, it would turn out the gunman's name was Kenneth Lamar Noid. And Kenneth Lamar Noid was not going into the store to get money or to steal food or to hurt, Daryl or Sean. He was there to get his revenge on Tom S. Monahan, who he looked at as the person responsible for coming up with this Noid campaign. because Kenneth Lamar Noyd was very mentally ill, and he believed the Avoid the Noyd campaign was not a marketing campaign, but rather Tom S. Monahan specifically targeting Kenneth Lamar Noyd, basically making him out to be this big villain. But Kenneth's plan for how to deal with this totally backfired, because in a totally ironic twist, by holding up this Domino's franchise and creating this huge standoff, he literally became like the Noyd, because no pizza deliveries could be had that entire day out of that franchise. And so Kenneth Lamar Noyd, in an effort to stop Tom S. Monahan from running this Noyd campaign, because I'm no villain, I don't go after pizzas, I don't try to stop people from getting their pizzas, in an effort to do that, that is exactly what he did. He literally became the human version of the Noyd. And so after Daryl and Sean made a run for it towards the door, Kenneth did grab his gun and he did aim it at the two men, and he even fired it a couple of times, but he missed, and Daryl and Sean were totally unhurt. In fact, nobody got hurt. All that happened is Kenneth Lamar Noyd looked like the Noyd, and he got arrested. However, instead of going to jail, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. As for the actual advertising campaign itself, which was very successful, Avoid the Noyd, well, it would not survive this total PR nightmare, and Tom S. Monahan canceled it immediately after Kenneth Lamar Noyd was taken off. So in a weird way, Kenneth actually did sort of get his revenge.
Avoid the Noyd. Domino's Pizza delivers. Call now.
Hey everybody, just a reminder, we do have that new limited merch line that's all around Siga Lung and him going rogue. There's the new graphic tee and tank top, there's the new pin, there's coasters, there's a sticker set. It's all really good stuff. Go to shopmrballen.com and get your Siga Lung merch to help support our rogue comrade who's going out there to get his revenge on the like button. Shopmrballen.com, go get that sweet, sweet Siga Lung merch now. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, remember we have multiple podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. We have MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories with hundreds of stories, many of which are not on YouTube, they're just on the podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. We have Runful, Bedtime Stories. All you got to do is go on any podcast platform and look up Ballen Studios, and boom, you got a whole bunch of stories you can go binge. Until next time, thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.